Thanks for joining us today, everyone. We're going to give it a few minutes and we'll get started right at 2. Thanks.
Hi everyone. We're just going to give people a couple more minutes to join us before we start, but I just wanted to point out some housekeeping things. We will leave plenty of time at the end of the webinar for some questions, so feel free to use the chat box to ask any and all your questions. And the webinar will be recorded and we'll send you an email with a link to the archived webinar so you can watch it at any time after, or pass it on to all your friends, and we'll get started shortly. Hi, folks. We're going to go ahead and get started. First, I just want to run through the housekeeping things for the few people who joined us. We will leave plenty of time for questions at the end of the webinar, so if you have questions, feel free to enter them into the chat box during the webinar, and we will answer them afterwards. Also, the webinar will be recorded, so we will send you a link with the webinar so you can watch it at any time. And let's go ahead and get started, I guess, on that note. So today we're going to be talking about the funding landscape, giving you kind of a view of what's been going on for those who've been tracking, who want a little bit more detail, or for those who are like, what just happened? We should answer all of those questions for you today, and also give you a sense of what you should expect going forward. So let's start off by doing some speaker introductions. My name is Tamia Crisp. I'm the Public Affairs Analyst here at AGU. I'm joined by Brittany Webster.
Hi, everyone. I'm a Senior Specialist here at AGU.
And our great intern, Annika.
Hi, everyone. I'm Annika Durlington, and I'm the intern.
And we have a wonderful guest speaker today, Ms. Virginia Ainsley. She'll be talking about the budget and appropriations process, what to expect in the future, and I will give her an introduction since she's our guest speaker today. Virginia Ainsley is the CEO of Ainsley & Associates and has more than 30 years of experience working with Congress on policy and funding issues, including research priorities. She currently teaches politics of the federal budget at George Washington University Graduate School of Political Management, and Ms. Ainsley has a BS in chemistry and a dual degree in political science from Michigan State University. And we are super happy to have her. And thank you so much for joining us, Jenny.
Thank you.
Okay, so what are we talking about today? So here's the rundown of what you can expect in this webinar. First, I'm going to start off by talking about a little bit of the current funding landscape, what's just happened, and where we are now. Brittany will then take over and talk a little bit about our specific agencies, our federal science agencies, what kind of funding they've been dealing with, and what funding they have now, according to the budget agreement, the spending agreement we have now. Then Jenny will take over for us, talking about the future and outlook and things that we should be concerned about, things we should be watching for. And then our wonderful intern, Annika, is going to be talking to us about how we can engage and take action and collectively amplify science's voice as we try to work for more robust science funding. Okay, so what's been going on currently? So first, I just wanted to put this up here. I notice it's not changing for our audience. Sorry, guys, hold on. I just want to make sure you guys can see the slide. Sorry, guys, just bear with us for one moment.
The button that says stop showing application, did you punch that?
Why you ask it? No, because okay. Don't play. Okay, we've got full screen, guys. If you hit the screen on the side, does it work?
Connection here.
Let's try it. I feel like it definitely does. But then when I try to, perfect.
Oh, but it looks like it's, the audience view is funky.
That's okay. At this point. Otherwise it doesn't show. Yeah, it doesn't show in here. Okay. We just have to do that. Okay.
Maybe we can start it with the like chopped version and then get Bob. Could he do things fast?
Hi, folks. Sorry about this. Just give us a couple more seconds. Thanks.
Hi guys, so sorry about that, but I think we fixed all of our issues. So I just want to quickly scroll through some of the slides. These are the lovely ladies speaking today, which we introduced ourselves. We gave you a rundown of what we'll be talking about, current landscape, specific agency information, the outlook, and ways to take action. And luckily we caught this before we started off with some really nifty information-intense slides. So let's get back to it. So first I wanted to start off by showing you guys exactly what the budget and appropriations process should be in theory. Normally what happens is in early February, O&B with the president will start working on the president's budget and release that to the public. Then what usually happens after that is that the Senate and the House budget committees will draft their own budget resolutions that really set those top line numbers of how much that all these subcommittees can spend. Once they're working off those numbers, the appropriations committees get together and they draft and negotiate the spending bills. These are the bills that actually fund the government. So they go through the normal committee legislation process, kind of think about Schoolhouse Rock there. So go through subcommittee, full committee, go to the floor. They must be identical in both chambers before they can be signed by the president into law. One thing to note is that the fiscal year starts on October 1st of every year. So the idea is that the spending bills should be done before then in order to make sure that the government is funded for the next fiscal year. This can happen in multiple ways, a continuing resolution or actual appropriations bills that fund the government through the whole fiscal year, but that's what should happen in theory. But if you were tracking the news, that's kind of not what happened this year. I think it was even more complicated because we had overlapping years where we were looking at both fiscal year 2018 and fiscal year 2019. So it may have seemed confusing where we were in the process. So let me just go back to kind of give you a sense of what happened so you know where we are now and how we're going forward. So we did have a number of short-term spending agreements to fund our government. We are well into fiscal year 2018, and we were really relying on those short-term spending bills to get us through. This was all because there was a number of contentious points for the spending agreement to go through. There were a number of priorities for folks that they wanted to negotiate before they were willing to solidify our spending agreement. This was everything from emergency funding for Puerto Rico, Florida, and Texas, to the debt ceiling, to infrastructure spending, which is a priority of President Trump, but also the idea of the spending caps. We were going to enter a sequestration situation if we didn't raise the spending caps, and it turns out Congress got together and they were able to deal with a number of these issues, not all of them, and they were able to also raise the caps. What this meant is there was now more money on the table that was allocated to both defense and non-defense discretionary spending, non-defense discretionary being where our federal science agencies are. And so that meant that instead of seeing massive cuts across the board, we actually had the room to add more money to a lot of these different programs and agencies. So that happened, and along with that, they also passed another short-term spending bill so that now that they had the budget agreement, they had some of those top-line numbers, they had more money on the table, they were trying to give themselves a buffer in order to negotiate the final spending bill for FY18. And they got that done. So last month, they passed a spending bill that will now fund us through September 30th. We had a number of actually great things that happened for science. With the extra money on the table, Congress actually allocated good increases for our federal science agencies, which was a pleasant surprise for many people. I think many people were bracing for some really significant cuts in those agencies. So basically, 5 continuing resolutions or short-term spending bills and 2 shutdowns later, we have funding for the rest of fiscal year 2018, which only puts us through September. So I just wanted to give you an overview of kind of what we saw in the omnibus. Basically, compared to the FY18 President's budget request, we saw really good numbers. The President's budget request for FY18 proposed significant cuts to our federal science agencies, particularly to programs like offices like EPA, would have saw detrimental cuts. So what you see here is the percent change between the omnibus that was passed last month and the president's budget request for FY18. And you'll see EPA was flat funded, but the other federal science agencies did see an increase. I just want to note that this is the overall budget for the agency. There were some programs that didn't get as good of a bump as some of the others, so there's a little nuance in this, but generally our federal agencies fared pretty well in the omnibus. So now that FY 2018 is over, we can't stop and rest on our laurels because we've already started FY 2019. This has started with the president's budget being released. His budget for FY19 was actually released before they finished FY18, which kind of complicated negotiations and also, I think, reflected on his budget and how Congress was going to consider some of the changes and cuts that he had proposed in that budget. So the FY19 budget came out, but then he also had to issue an addendum because with the budget deal, there was more money on the table. So then he proposed how he would allocate that extra money. A couple things to note is there were still some drastic cuts to our domestic programs, our non-defense discretionary programs, which include our federal science agencies. There's issues with the deficit, which Jenny will talk more about and how that impacts science. Most all of our science agencies got cut. There are some programs that Trump has favored, like nuclear energy programs that got a plus up, but most other science programs got cut. The other thing to note is with the budget agreement and with there being more money on the table, they noted in their addendum that they were going to take all the money that was available for defense spending and allocate it. They made a proposal for where they would use all of that money. On the other hand, for non-defense discretionary, they left some of the money on the table. They basically said that they wouldn't use all of that money. And I think one quote that kind of sums up their view on it is that the administration does not believe these non-defense spending levels comport with its vision for the proper role and size of the federal government. Basically saying they don't think that we need to be using all this money in that bucket. They used some of it, but they left some of it on the table. They said they're very concerned about the deficit, and that's where they're willing to cut in order to address some of those concerns. Some notable provisions in the FY19 budget agreement, President's budget request that I just wanted to highlight for you folks. We talked about the addendum, how it raised the defense funding, but also left some money on the table for non-defense discretionary funding. Other things that were in the budget were eliminations to ARPA-E. There were reductions to climate-related programs. Things like NASA Office of Education would have been cut. And some of these agencies, they proposed to cut the workforce. One thing that's really interesting about this is that because the spending bill came out after the president's budget, it's really interesting to see language that appropriators put in the spending bills that contradict the president's budget. Things like telling EPA that they shouldn't reduce their workforce anymore. While when you look at the FY19 president's budget request, you would see that he is proposing to make significant cuts to our federal workforce. So some of those things were really interesting in the fact that Congress seemed to basically ignore a lot of the recommendations that the president had. So what can we expect going forward? Jenny will talk more about this, but I just wanted to highlight for you that the new fiscal year starts October 1st. So they have until the 30th of September to pass some kind of spending bill. This could be a short-term spending bill, and a lot of people are talking about that being highly possible, but it could also be a bill that funds the government through the entire fiscal year, which for our agencies is nice for them to have predictability, know how much funding they will have for the whole year, so we definitely advocate for that. A couple things to note also is that the president's budget request is not law. So even though people are very riled up about the proposed cuts, it's really an outline of his priorities and doesn't mean that those are the actual cuts that we would see in a spending bill. We also want to note that the budget agreement that we have now only lasts through FY 2019, so we'll have to revisit that for future fiscal years. And then also Congress has the final say. So as we'll talk about later, there are opportunities now for you to start engaging with Congress and really talking about the value of science. And that's a really important place to be having that conversation because Congress has the final say in what the spending levels will be. And with that, I will pass it over to Brittany, who will talk about specific agencies and what they kind of saw in the spending bill.
Thanks, Tania. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how both the budget and the omnibus impacted agencies, but also kind of build upon Tania's analysis, kind of how these two spending documents have influenced each other or not. Overall, you can see that the president's science priorities are most often emphasized by what's flat funded or not cut, and not with major increases in funding. If a program does see an increase, it's often due to a cut to another program within the agency. More so than in previous administrations, the president's budget has been marked by an adherence to fiscal constraints. Relative to other science agencies, DOE's top line has fared well in the administration's budgets, although individual programs may have faced more unbalanced support. Like NSF, DOE was saved from a harsher cut by the president's addendum, which added another $1.5 billion to the agency's proposed top-line number. In the FY18 omnibus, most programs within the Office of Science received an increase over the FY17 enacted levels, with a few programs receiving flat funding or slight cuts, including workforce development for teachers and scientists. Like the Office of Science broadly, ARPA-E, or the Advanced Research Projects Agency Energy, and Science Laboratory Infrastructure both received at least a 15% increase. In fact, ARPA-E, despite facing elimination in both of the president's budget requests, received record-level funding at over $350 million. And this is really a testament to bipartisan congressional support for this program. Some other specific winners of the omnibus include the Advanced Scientific Computing Research Program, which is also supported by the administration and received $605 million. And you'll see in the president's FY19 budget, this program received a 39% increase. Additionally, the Experimental Program to Stimulate Competitive Research, or EPSCoR, which was eliminated under the president's budget at DOE, but also at other agencies, received $20 million within DOE. So for NASA, I would say within the omnibus, Chairman Culberson, who is chairman of the House Commerce, Justice, Science Subcommittee, he provided specific funding levels for both a Europa Clipper and lander, which isn't part of the decadal survey, but definitely contributes to planetary science getting a bump up this year. Moving to the administration side, the president's budget also provides a bit of a bump for planetary science, and that's because his FY19 request includes funding for planetary defense. Moving to Earth science, the administration has said that it's prioritizing or focusing on specific missions, in addition, which you see a little bit in their cancellation of 5 Earth science missions. And Congress, though, explicitly puts those 5 missions back into the FY18 omnibus. Unfortunately, heliophysics saw a bit of a bump in the omnibus. Neither the administration nor Congress really has much to say about the program right now. Turning to James Webb, we recently found out that James Webb is going to require a bit more time and probably will not be launched this year. However, statutorily, by law, James Webb's budget cannot go over $8 billion, but with the projected delay, it's definitely going to go over that $8 billion limit, so it'll be interesting to see how the FY19 appropriations process plays out for that. Education was once again cut in the president's budget. Last year, he cut it significantly. This year, he completely eliminated the program. But Congress wrote the program, Congress confirmed that they are very supportive of the Department of Education, specifically Space Grant and EPSCoR, and flat-funded education at $100 million. It's not mentioned on here since this is not a huge focus for AGU, but the president's budget also cut WFIRST and within the astrophysics mission, and part of that explanation was because I believe it's the largest part of the astrophysics division, but Congress explicitly in the FY18 omnibus reinstates W first because it is the #1 decadal priority. And one of the themes you'll kind of see is Congress's stricter adherence to decadal surveys and the administration willing to let some of those priorities go in favor of fiscal constraint. It'll be interesting to see this year how the national space policy comes into play and how Congress and the administration work to create more commercial opportunities within NASA. So moving to NOAA, overall, NOAA saw a 3% increase in funding for FY18. This is a major victory given that the President's FY19 budget would have cut NOAA by 20%, which is even more damaging than the President's request for FY18. The Oceanic and Atmospheric Research received a 7% increase, and again, this is in direct contradiction to the President's budget, which recommended cutting this program or line item by 37%. Despite Trump's proposals, the climate research within Oceanic and Atmospheric Research, it received no cuts. Satellites, specifically JPSS and GOES, under NASDS were fully funded. The decreases you see there were actually planned decreases since NOAA has launched 2 satellites within the past year. The omnibus also prioritized NOAA implementing the Weather Research and Forecasting Act of 2017, which Trump signed into law last year. This law emphasizes providing funding to improve weather data, modeling, computing, forecast infrastructure, and warnings to allow the agency to develop more accurate, timely, and effective warnings and forecasts of weather events that endanger life and property. Turning to National Science Foundation, National Science Foundation got a huge bump from the administration in the addendum. Without the addendum and kind of the funding provided by the bipartisan budget agreement, NSF would have been cut by 30% in the President's budget. In the FY18 omnibus, Congress specifically referenced the NSF the National Science Board indicators and the rise in R&D spending by other countries, specifically China, as a justification for the 4% increase to NSF's top line. The omnibus also provides funding for 3 regional class research vessels, which has been a congressional priority. Even under Obama, this has been a priority for Congress. And one thing to watch here is the omnibus doesn't get down into directorate level spending, but in the administration's budget for FY19, they included funding for NSF's 10 big ideas within the directorate level, and originally it was envisioned that the 10 big ideas would be funded by additional money, maybe even their own account. So it'll be interesting to see how NSF tries to implement these 10 big ideas without sacrificing any of kind of the activities at the directorate level. And finally, I'll turn to the USGS, which received a 6% increase in funding in the omnibus. Specific programs, including funding and including hazards, and within hazards, turning volcanoes and earthquakes saw a 23% increase in the spending bill. The climate and land use line item is now being referred to as land resources. And thankfully, no climate science centers were eliminated or any funding lines eliminated. They're just restructuring this mission area. And despite the President's budget request, USGS will continue to have 8 climate science centers, despite the call to consolidate that to 3. And in December 2017, Trump issued an executive order focusing on strengthening the nation's critical minerals, resources, and development. And you can see Congress kind of agrees with that priority, and they provided a 9% increase for the energy, minerals, and environmental health line item. And that's it for me. I will turn it over to Jenny.
Thank you, Brittany. The chart that shows competing spending priorities is one that's probably going to haunt us for at least the next 20 years. You'll notice that about 2/3 of all we spend is on mandatory and entitlement programs. Those are programs which have to pay out based on the eligibility of people who apply or corporations that apply. It can't be changed unless Congress and the President decide to change authorizing law. So about a third of total spending is in the discretionary pot. A little more than half goes to defense. A little less than half goes to non-defense. Only about 3%, actually a little less than 3%, is actually targeted to research and development. The one piece of this pie chart we really need to keep a close watch on is net interest. It is now at $315 billion per year. That is slated to grow, and we are beginning to hit a high slope on that. The rising deficit will impact future funding, especially discretionary funding, for at least the next 20 years, regardless of who gets elected president, regardless of which party controls the White House and Congress. Debt will be a major issue. Within the next 5 to 7 years, the cost of interest is likely to be as large as the cost of defense. It's important to remember that one of the biggest holders of U.S. IOUs is China. If China starts slowing down its purchase of U.S. debt, the interest rates will increase faster than anticipated by this pie chart. The next graph shows you how this relates to the size of the economy. You can see that in wars, the amount of debt compared to GDP goes up very quickly. And even though we aren't in one war, we're in several protracted military encounters, that slope is going up very high and very fast. And interest is going to be taking up more and more of every tax dollar, to the point where every U.S. taxpayer owes about $174,000 as their proportional piece of U.S. debt now. The box that says the administration does not believe these non-defense spending levels comport with vision for the proper role and size of the federal government is very telling. They are already telling you that they are not going to put their emphasis in their FY19 budget proposal. As a matter of fact, they pretty much abandoned a number of the specifics in that already. Congress rejected so much of the FY18 Trump budget, it's likely to do it again for FY19, that the administration is going to focus on actually implementing the omnibus bill, and we'll have to watch to make sure they actually fulfill their obligations under that. In the next slide, usually we have a lot of strong voices for science within an administration. Many of these appointments are not filled at all. That is very deliberate. The Office of Science and Technology Policy, which is basically the advisor to the White House on long-term policy impacts and what scientists have to say about that, is all but a ghost town these days. If you take a look at what's going to happen in the coming year as we prepare for the November elections, 2 or 3 things to notice. First of all, Congress is not going to pass very much significant legislation at all. It might try and pass a farm bill. That is important because it will affect the cost of food stamps. That could be very controversial, but that's likely to be the only major bill Congress takes up between now and Election Day. Furthermore, the House and Senate have both decided they don't need to do a budget resolution this year. That makes sense. We have a budget deal that covers FY19. But what that also means is there cannot be a reconciliation bill. You can't do a reconciliation bill without a joint House-Senate budget resolution. That means there will be no technical corrections tax bill. There will be no major moves to repeal Obamacare. And there will be no major moves to alter entitlements and mandatory spending, with the possible exception of programs covered by the Farm Bill. There are only 45 legislative days between now and the end of fiscal 18. That's not very long at all. Another reason I don't think they're going to get very much done. If you look at the map, you will see that there are 19 Senate Democratic seats up for re-election, 2 more for the independents. That's King from Maine and Bernie Sanders from Vermont. There are only 9 Republicans up, but of the 19 Democratic seats up, 10 of those are in states that are pretty red. Trump won them handily last year, so those are going to be very tough races. It's entirely possible we could end up next year with a Senate that has more Republican votes than we have now. The opposite is true on the House side. On average, the president's party loses 32 seats in the House in a mid-year election. The Democrats have to win only 23 seats to gain control of the lower chamber. So it's more likely that even without a a major blue wave, we will see a change of control. On the House side, we are far less likely to see it on the Senate side. You'll also notice in all the dots on the right-hand side that both parties are very divided. And really how well they stay together will determine how well each party does in House and Senate races this fall. I wanted to alert you to something I learned from a contact at OMB today, and that is that OMB and the White House are determined not to abide by the spending agreement that was just passed. In other words, even though we passed the omnibus bill, the White House does not intend to fully meet all of its non-defense spending commitments under that bill. The good news is that I do not think science programs are targeted to be cut back in the implementation of that bill. Theoretically, the executive branch must spend everything that's in the enacted appropriations law, but occasionally they don't. It's called impoundment when they do not spend or they essentially cancel enacted appropriations law. But at any rate, they are going to start slow walking the spending in that omnibus bill. Out there in the field is probably the first place that you will notice this. If you find out that your grant money is not coming when you expect it, if there's any slowdown in when they pay you back reimbursement checks, let us know. It's one of the ways we can keep track to make sure that they are meeting their commitments with regard to the science funding we got in the omnibus. This also tells us that even though we're going to have, I think, more room in FY19 based on the spending deal, we may have to fight hard all of next year to make sure we get the appropriated funding that is eventually awarded in the appropriations bill this year. Given that there's only 45 legislative days between now and the end of the fiscal year, it's almost guaranteed we will see at least one CR, probably several before Election Day. Election Day will determine how fast they deal with the appropriations bill after that. Everyone would like it to be in place before the start of the new Congress, but there's no guarantee that that will happen. So even though we have a budget deal, and I think your non-defense discretionary numbers especially look better in FY19 than they have in the past, I think it's worth remembering that we will still have to fight for those. Although that deal was cut this year, we still have a Congress that may be reluctant to fulfill all those non-defense obligations, and a White House that fully intends to not fulfill those obligations. So we'll need to keep. Do let us know if you see any slowdown in your funding.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So now let's talk a little bit about things that all of you guys can do and what we're doing here at EGU to help make sure that we're getting that strong funding. And we're really pushing Congress to remember that science is valuable, not only our economy, our national security, but also the health and well-being of local communities.
Great. Thanks, Leah and Jenny. On that note, what AGU is doing is we're engaging on the Hill by sending letters to members of Congress and meeting with staff to make sure that they understand the need for robust funding. We're building coalitions who share the same values around science, and we're also helping constituents plan office visits so that they can share the value of their science. You are those constituents, though, and we need your voice, which is so impactful to your representatives. We would like to thank the legislators for the overall strong science funding levels that they approved for fiscal year 2018. And for fiscal year 2019, we want to make sure to ask for robust funding for all science programs since their outcomes are interconnected. As a side note, in addition to ensuring science funding, we have to keep an eye out for harmful riders that can get tacked onto bills during the appropriations process. And the best ways to stay informed about the latest riders or science program changes or slowdowns to the spending omnibus is to use these resources listed on the bottom right-hand side of the slide. And other ways you can engage are by signing up for AGU Science Policy Alerts. You can follow us on Twitter at our handle, which is at AGU Sci Policy. You can write your legislator at our Action Center. You can schedule a meeting locally with your representative during the upcoming congressional recess from the 30th of April to May 4th. Or you can use our helpful science policy toolkits to get other ideas for forms of engagement that suit you best. And you can always find out more at sciencepolicy.agu.org, or feel free to email us at sciencepolicy@agu.org. And with that, we'll hand it over for questions. Thank you.
Awesome. I just want to note before we get into questions that we will send you the slides, and so you'll have all the links to the resources that we covered just now. So if you need those, don't worry, we've got you. We do have one question right now that just came in, so while people are formulating, we'll start with this one. How many of the proposed budget or the proposed program cuts across federal government are for publicity purposes and have no chance of being cut? Is this a theme? Who should go? Who would like to take a first stab at this?
Remember that the administration FY19 budget proposal was written before we had the omnibus in place. Mulvaney is head of the OMB. He's a former member of the Freedom Caucus. He likes to stretch as far as he can in any written document, and therefore the White House budget for FY19 is very aggressive and offers to cut a lot of programs, including many science programs. He would love to do that, but it's their best shot. What's been interesting to watch is that in the budget hearings we've had, both before authorizing and appropriations committees, the administration is not strongly defending their cuts as much as it's defending an overall position of spending less on non-defense overall. So I think the specific cuts they've suggested is what they will probably go after first. That tells us where we need to be on the watch. It also tells us where we need to beef up support in Congress, because those will be the ones that the White House is least likely to sign off on an increase for. On the other hand, the specific cuts in this budget I don't think should keep you up at night. I have been asked, well, what do you mean they aren't going to spend the money they just passed in the omnibus bill? Can they do that legally? And the answer to that is there's two ways to do it, and one is legal. It's called a rescission bill. The administration can request a whole list of rescissions. That goes to the House and the Senate. They have to pass that within 45 legislative days, or it is not approved. It requires proactive action by Congress for approval. If they don't approve it, or if that vote goes down, then the administration is obligated under law to spend that money. On the other hand, we have often seen administrations try and slow down spending on things they don't agree with. The most egregious example of this was Richard Nixon. And one of the things that happened after Nixon was out of office was Congress passed the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act, which literally makes it a federal law. The executive branch must implement appropriations law. On the other hand, we have seen Bill Clinton tried to get a line item veto. The Supreme Court in 1998 said that was not constitutional. That was Congress trying to, it would be letting go of its power of the purse. That was unconstitutional. So I think the bluster you hear about line item veto is probably just bluster. On the other hand, if they do start slowing down spending, and they do it not too conspicuously, and if Congress does not object, so much of the responsibility for making the executive branch do what they're obligated to do under budget law rests with Congress, and the current Republican leaders in both houses. To be honest, they're just trying to avoid tough votes this year. And the last thing, especially in the Senate, McConnell wants a vote on is the rescission bill. So I think the one thing that might come through in a rescission or reprogramming bill is his request to build the wall with defense funding. That doesn't just not spend money that was appropriated. It actually changes the purpose from defense to non-defense. That should not happen at all unless Congress approves it. Will Congress approve it? I think it depends on whether they're asked. If they don't want to be asked, they would just soon ignore that. But if they are asked, how much does the administration ask for? If they ask for a significant amount, be aware that they may ask for an equivalent reduction in non-defense spending. So we need to be on the alert for that as well.
So a couple things that I just wanted to add is that we've seen the Entitlement Act kind of in practice early in the Trump administration. They were trying to slow down funding, particularly for ARPA-E at DOE, and a number of our congressional champions wrote into them and basically said this is illegal, and asked GAO, who does investigation and oversight of some of these agencies, to investigate that to see if it was illegal, and it was subsequently overturned. They decided to stop doing that because it was highlighted that that could be illegal. So just to Jenny's point, I think it's really important for us to keep an eye on it and kind of make sure that we are telling our congressional champions that these things are happening so that they can take appropriate action and help be that buffer for some of these things.
Right. You can make a difference. We can make a difference with Congress if we know early enough what they're trying to do to slow down funding, and we can make it much harder for them to get by with that. So it's not hopeless by any means at all, but we need early intelligence.
One other question we have is, can we explain what a rider is?
I love it.
Brittany, do you want to take that one?
Sure. So appropriation bills technically are not supposed to be, they're not supposed to have policy provisions in them, other than funding, because funding is a policy decision. But, you know, often we come to this, I'll say, midnight kind of Cinderella time where we need to pass an appropriations bill, and we need to pass all 12 of them together. And so it's kind of basically one big yes or no, basically vote. And so a lot of times what people will do is they will take something that's more controversial, something that can't pass on its own, and they will try to attach it to an appropriations bill. And normally this is, I'll say, it's only tangentially related to funding. Normally it is something that is policy, like DACA. And they will try to attach it to an appropriations bill as a rider because they know the only things that Congress has to do is appropriations. And when you take 12 spending bills and you put them into one bill, you know, it's really hard to vote down, you know, spending for the federal government, especially since a lot of people see that as really Congress's only job. It's the only thing they have to do every year. So if you can add a controversial bill that would never pass on its own to something Congress, you know, really does have to do and is really like the main part of their job, so it's riding along the appropriations process, if you will.
I think we're going to see more of these omnibus bills passed in future years, partly because it's getting very difficult to pass anything in Congress, even when one party controls both chambers. Also, many members don't have much say in what passes into law at all. If you're not on the Appropriations Committee, you really have very little impact on what happens, and all the work you put in being a member of Congress doesn't count for much. So really, riders are one of the few ways many members of Congress have to affect federal law at all, which is one reason they're usually a very active topic of discussion whenever an appropriations bill is pending.
So we have another question here. How are the research agencies in the Defense Department impacted by the FY18 budget and the FY19 proposal?
So I just read this, so I can tell you that the Defense Science and Technology Program, their budget increased by 6% under fiscal year 2018, under the omnibus that just passed. And just more generally speaking, since AGU doesn't tend to focus on DoD funding as much, that science actually has not been a huge priority for the administration within DoD either. But Jenny, I don't know if you have more to add.
I would agree with that. That may change. There are rumblings that Russia and China are far ahead of us on missile and nuclear and other kinds of defense technologies. If that is in fact the case, I suspect we will see a bump in DoD R&D in FY19 and FY20.
I think one thing to note when we're talking about messaging, when you're reaching out to your members of Congress, having those in-district visits, is for members of Congress to understand that all of these sciences are interconnected. So we don't want to see them picking winners and losers by increasing with DoD research and then decreasing, say, NSF research, because really all of those agencies, as we all know, they help each other, right? So the discoveries that we have that are funded by NSF money will help in some of our defense aspects. So I just think that that's something that doesn't always get translated very well, and I think the more that we can make connections so that we can relate to them, that we shouldn't be picking one type of science, one agency over another, that those collaborations between agencies are when we're our strongest. Okay, I don't see any more questions, so I guess we will wrap up there. If you do have any other questions, feel free to email us at sciencepolicy@agu.org. It's up there on the screen. We're happy to answer all your questions. If you have if you would like to meet your member of Congress in the district, we talked a little bit about our toolkits. Feel free to go to our website. We have step-by-step toolkits on how to request a meeting, how to prepare your message in your ask, how to prepare a leave behind. It goes through all the steps for you, so we make it really easy for you. And we really hope that you go out there and help amplify our voice. As you've heard, there are going to be some challenges ahead of us, and we're going to need everyone here together to really overcome those barriers and make sure that science gets a good piece of the pie. We're not left behind.
Don't give up. If your member in the House is a Republican and they voted against almost everything you hold dear, remember that you can still get their attention and turn them into a strong voice for science. They are particularly nervous this year. They are looking for input from constituents about what they can do to make constituents happy, and you can encourage them to become a strong voice for science if they have not up till now. I think they will be much more likely to be responsive to you this year than they have been any time in the last 10 years.
And I think messaging will be key, connecting it back to those things that we can all get behind, like the economy, national security. So if we can really shape our messaging about how our science is helping those things, I think that's a winning message. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jenny, for being with us. Thank you, everyone on the phone, for joining us today. We'll send you a follow-up email with more information and the slides, and reach out if you need anything. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.